everyone. Welcome to Certificate Course in Dialogue Studies 2023-2024, Week 5, Session 2. We have with us Dr. Irfanullah Farooqi. He's the Assistant Professor at the Department of Sociology in South Asian University. Dr. Farooqi, we welcome you. He would be speaking today on education as dialogue with regards to Tagore. And Dr. Farooqi, the floor is yours. Please feel free to start. Thank you.
So yes, I'm grateful for this opportunity. And it's a wonderful opportunity indeed. And I'm, of course, grateful to the participants here for their attendance this late afternoon. I sincerely hope that in the next 40 to 45 minutes, I'm able to offer something of intellectual merit, just to make sure that this overall exercise does not turn out to be a total and tragic waste. So as you already know, I have chosen to share my thoughts on one of Tagore's absolutely brilliant essays titled My School. I'm sure it was circulated in advance, so I'm assuming at least some of you managed to read it from start to finish, and in all likelihood were left spellbound by the unusual blend of lucidity and profundity that the essay offers. I'm going to speak on, as has already been mentioned, education as dialogue, reflections on Tagore. So I will borrow from Tagore, but my fundamental premise is education as dialogue. And I'll try and see to what extent Tagore helps us in that regard. Now, we know, in fact, we know very well about the importance, or shall we say, the centrality of dialogue in education. This is something that I suppose most of us are aware of, all of us are aware of. Something we call dialogic education. One that swears by parity of parties, fearless exchange of ideas and opinions between the teacher and the taught, between the two sides of the table, as we say, and some sort of a principled allegiance to collaborative learning and unlearning. This is something that we are well aware of, dialogic education, or the importance, vitality, centrality of dialogue in education. Needless to say, the importance of dialogue in education cannot be contested. I don't think there are two opinions about it. It is important, and it will always be as important as anything can be. But I am interested in pushing this education and dialogue bit and make a case for education as dialogue, something that the title says. The fact that dialogue is implicit in education and is not something that needs to be brought in, right? So it is not an additional thing. I'm trying to make a case for dialogue as a subset of education, that education in a certain sense implies dialogue. And in this regard, I essentially borrow from Tagore. So when we get into education as dialogue, we end up thinking about education in a very different way. And I'm sure we agree that this kind of makes a call for some kind of a paradigm shift or some sort of an epochal shift the moment we start referring to education as dialogue. So when we go from dialogue in education, or when we go from education and dialogue to education as dialogue, we are already embarking upon something absolutely extraordinary. So there is an important shift in our frames of comprehension. When we begin to see education as dialogue, we are forced to redefine education and its purpose. So this is something that I'll keep going back to. What does it mean to be educated? What does it mean to educate? What does education in general imply? So we start with the question, what is education? What does it mean to get educated? what does it mean to educate, right? So these are the questions that we will engage with as we go down the track. Now, there is, and I'm sure all of you will agree with me that the conventional answers for these, so if you were to kind of provide a conventional answer vis-a-vis what is education, I don't think we'll go very far with the conventional answer. Not to demean the conventional answers, but it's just that the questions require an extra mile on our part. So these questions, what is education? What does it mean to educate and be educated? These questions acquire a very different significance in the broader debate, in the broader context within which we find ourselves. So to begin with, if we start with this idea of education as dialogue, we will have to turn inwards and do away with the outward. Now, what do I mean by that? So generally speaking, when we talk about education, the conventional frames of comprehension vis-a-vis education, we are primarily looking at education as something that must contribute, that has to do with the outer, the world, right? But here we'll have to look at education as something that must contribute to the inner, the self, and not the outer and the world. Now, before you question me, indeed, the self and the world cannot be and ought not to be treated as compartmentalized entities, or they ought not to be referred to in isolation. So the self and the world, they always correspond with each other, they complement each other all the time. So there are no two opinions about that. So I'm not at all making a case that the self is one isolated realm and the world is another isolated realm. Because they, of course, correspond with each other, they complement each other. So education, of course, has to engage with the outward. Nobody is pointing out that education must stop engaging with the outward, the world. It must, one way or another, at some point or another. Education has no other option but to engage with the world. But what I'm suggesting is an important reordering. Reordering that is to be carried out by underlining the primacy of self. So in this scheme of things, I'm placing the self as the most important reference and the uncommon vitality of understanding. So I am making a case for the primacy of understanding. And the moment we make a case for the primacy of understanding, we are automatically making a case for the primacy of self. Now, if we go back to Tagore's essay, My School, it helps us understand the importance of that much needed shift in relation to the fundamental ways in which education is conceptualized. So if you read, and you can always share your thoughts a bit later, as soon as I'm done, if you read the essay from start to finish, Tagore, in many ways, and of course, as a magician, his prose is absolutely, what should we say? It's out of the world kind of a prose in a good way, of course. So, through multiple ways, Tagore is simply trying to point out the importance of a certain kind of a holistic conception of education, right? And he is particularly interested in children's education and the education of the child. But he is trying to kind of bring to the fore this understanding of the inner, the understanding, the primacy of understanding, etc. So there is a shift that you get to sense when you read this essay from start to finish. And let me just share a few pointers. All of these pointers are essentially talking about the same stuff, but just to kind of elucidate further, I'll draw your attention to these pointers. So the first, of course, is from the outward to inward. So the shift that we see, the shift that Tagore is making a case for, that is to be understood through the move from, number one, outward to inward. So as opposed to something, education is something that is only geared towards the world and a certain kind of a preoccupation with the external reality, education must be turned inward, right? It needs to reorient itself, and it needs to kind of address the inner and not really remain preoccupied with the outer. Similarly, from the world to self. So basically the same thing, from outward to inward, from world to self. And then a very important reference, from explanation to understanding. And this is crucial because usually when we discuss the idea of explanation, implicit in the idea or in the act of explanation is the fact that there are two parties. There is a party that is explaining, and then there is another party to which that a particular thing is explained, right? Now, the one who's explaining is on a higher pedestal as compared to the one who is being explained, or to whom explanation, or for whom explanation is carried out. So, explanation also, in some senses, is geared towards the outer. Now, if you think about explanation and then think about understanding, what's the difference? Understanding is basically something that is once again to do with the self. So if I'm explaining something, that is one side of the story. But if I'm understanding something, that is a completely different side of the story. Now, what happens in the modern world in the context of education is that there is a lot of explanation. In fact, it is full of explanation, but there's not much understanding that's happening. So if I were to give an example, in this kind of a world where education is hopelessly determined by a certain logic of explanation, you will find instances and numerous instances wherein people will speak about injustice. People will take classes on rights. People will take classes on caste, on gender, on exploitation, discrimination, inequality, and they will steal the show. You will find them to be most eloquent. You will find them to be absolutely flawless, impeccable in their performance. But because they swear by the grammar of explanation, this is merely a performance. This is not really something that has touched the inside of these performers, these teachers, these pedagogues. So that's the world in which we live, wherein it is absolutely possible to be well versed with feminism and yet be patriarchal, to be well versed with all kinds of solid anti caste literature, yet be casteist, to be well versed with the problems with racism, yet be a racist, and so on and so forth. Now, this is a world that is all about explanation. So, I, as an individual, as a teacher, could give a brilliant lecture on inequality, on discrimination, on exploitation, on injustice, and I can just woo my audience to no end. But there is always a possibility that in my own life, I remain unjust, that I am somebody who perpetrates or who contributes to discrimination, who is a patriarch, and so on and so forth. And this is the world in which we live. And this is the world, according to me, that swears by the logic of explanation and not understanding. Because understanding would require a lot more. As we say, there is a cost to understanding. So explaining caste is one thing. Explaining gender violence is another thing, is one thing. And understanding it is a completely different business. Because the moment you understand it, you have no other option but to change a lot of things in your own life. So, which is why most of us are always a bit reluctant vis-a-vis understanding, because understanding is a very costly affair. It can lead to a lot of reshuffling in day-to-day life, and therefore, why bother? So, the world finds explanation a more convenient vantage point. But what Tagore's essay tells us is that we need to kind of move from explanation to understanding. And only then we can actually think about education as dialogue. Something similar is from demonstration to discovery. And I'm borrowing this from a great sociologist, Robert Nisbet, who wrote a fantastic book decades ago. It's called Sociology as an Art Form. Brilliant work, absolutely brilliant. And Nisbet talks about two important positions in the context of sociology and sociological imagination and theorizing. And he calls one the logic of demonstration, and he calls the other the logic of discovery. Now, the logic of demonstration is pretty much the logic of explanation. And the logic of discovery is something that's to do with a willingness to be surprised. That's to do with a certain allegiance to uncertainty, and also a very principled humility and modesty. And Nisbet makes a case for logic of discovery, that we as students, learners, we as teachers, as fellow travelers, we as sociology people, whatever, we as, those who are in the pursuit of education, we should actually swear by, we should have an unconditional allegiance to the logic of discovery and not the logic of demonstration. So in some senses, Tagore's essay also makes a case for this very, very important shift from demonstration to discovery. And then something with which the essay begins, I suppose it's in the first paragraph or maybe the second paragraph, if I remember correctly, he makes a distinction between originality and truthfulness. And that's a very important distinction, particularly for the academic world. It's an absolutely, absolutely remarkable distinction. Now, the question is, some of us might think that being original is being truthful, but that's actually not the case. You could very well be original without being truthful. And academia all the time is original, but is rarely truthful. The academic practitioners, the practitioners of academia, the academics, they are original more often than not, but are they truthful? One doesn't know. My hunch is they are not that often. And once again, originality is to do with the outward. Truthfulness has to do with the inward. So when you're talking about being truthful, you are essentially true to your own self. And when you're talking about being original, there is a certain sense of audience with which you're working. So originality is oriented towards the outward, the world, whereas truthfulness is about the inner world, the self. And lastly, from knowledge to acceptance. Again, Tagore beautifully writes somewhere in the middle of the essay that we have not come to this world merely to know it, but to accept it. So acceptance will always be considered as more important than knowledge. And when we talk about education as dialogue, we have to think about it as something that is making a case for going beyond knowledge and arriving at the at the planes of acceptance. So acceptance is always above knowledge. And I'll come to this. Now, I should also, once I have kind of shared with you the brief, shall we say, the ways in which this entire thing is to unfold in the next 15 to 20 minutes, let me also share my thoughts on dialogue, because only then I suppose we'll be in a better position to draw the connections or see the linkages. So I must also put on record, how am I looking at dialogue? So I'm not going to get into definitions, but I will talk about a few things that, according to me, are central to the ways in which I conceptualize dialogue. Now, one thing, and perhaps these are some of these things, because generally speaking, dialogue is something that we hear about a lot in the context of peace and conflict studies, in the context of conflict resolution, area studies, international relations, diplomacy, and so on. So I have got nothing to do with any of that. My reading of dialogue is very, very mundane. It's from the everyday, and it's very, it's a reading, it's an understanding that is always in the making. So it is tentative, but at the same time, I'm assuming it makes some sense. So let me start with making the first point in relation to how do I conceptualize dialogue, and perhaps that will help us understand why I make this case, education as dialogue. So when I think of dialogue, I'm thinking about the primacy of the ongoing. right? The primacy of the ongoing, the here and now. There's something markedly Buddhist about it, the here and now, that the only reality is the one that in which I exist, the here and now. Now, dialogue has a certain allegiance, has a deep loyalty towards the existing, the moment in which it is taking place. Dialogue is about a certain significance that we attach to the process. So dialogue is about the ongoing, the primacy of the ongoing, the primacy of the process, the primacy of the here and now. That's the starting point. Now let me explain this in a minute or two. So dialogue is also to do with a certain kind of indifference, in fact, absolute indifference to the goal, the end, the objective. Now, I'm not at all proposing that dialogue does not have an objective. Of course, dialogue has an objective, dialogue has an end. But when I say it of course has an objective, and what could be possibly the objective of dialogue? What could be a possible end of dialogue, or an end that dialogue has in mind? Perhaps a more informed understanding. That is, of course, an end. So dialogue definitely has an end. But what I was pointing out, what I'm trying to point out is that dialogue as an exercise is not committed to, definitely not committed to an instrumental end-driven pursuit. So you don't get into a dialogue with this idea that I will nail it this time. So that kind of a very crass, calculated, instrumental, end-driven pursuit is something that dialogue has nothing to do with, right? A certain kind of a pursuit that completely compromises the sanctity of means, that is something that dialogue has nothing to do with, right? So that's what I meant when I pointed out that dialogue has an absolute indifference to the goal. So what will happen as a result of dialogue? I honestly don't know. But definitely what I know is that after this particular dialogue, I will be more informed about the issue, the theme I'm contemplating on and deliberating on and sharing my thoughts on, and so on. So any pursuit that compromises the sanctity of means is not dialogue has nothing to do with that pursuit. So a dialogic pursuit is one that does not compromise the sanctity of means. Now here, so again, this whole idea of the journey, and I think most of us keep referring to this, that it is the journey and not the destination. And I'm reminded of Nehru's iconic work, Discovery of India, and how beautifully Nehru writes about the idea of discovery, and particularly in the chapter, The Quest, when he talks about India as a civilization. Nehru beautifully talks about how, how this process of knowing India is a series of enlightenments, as it were. So what Buddha, I said, of course, he's not making that argument. I, as a mediocre reader, I'm just sort of maybe imposing this, but there's a certain kick in this idea of the primacy of the reader. So this whole thing about knowing India, and every moment your understanding of India keeps getting it acquires a certain newness, right? So the journey, you keep discovering India again and again and again. So a completely different conceptualization of novelty, and that is something that dialogue is committed to. The primacy of the ongoing, that the ongoing will keep informing you about the implicit, the deeply hidden novelty that is there. So that is how I start my reading of the idea of the dialogue, the idea of dialogue. Dialogue, secondly, dialogue for me is also, and this is where I kind of get into Tagore, dialogue for me is also premised on fearlessness. So anyone who agrees or who earnestly, sincerely, and in some senses, I wouldn't say, most fervently, demonstrates a certain allegiance to dialogue, indirectly also demonstrates a principled fearlessness, right? So if you are into a dialogue, then in some senses it suggests that you are not being fearful, that you're not under any fear, you're not afraid of anything. Because usually those who escape dialogue, or those who remain reluctant vis-a-vis dialogue, are people who are subject to fear. They have a certain anxiety, because dialogue is about a certain willingness to lose. It's about a certain willingness to retreat. It's about a certain willingness to withdraw. And that willingness can only come in, can only figure, can only be a part of uh, the scheme, the framework, when we are fearless. Right? There's a certain fearlessness that needs to be there. It's a prerequisite. And remember, fearlessness, and this is where I get into Tagore, is a prerequisite for any creative act, any creative work. You cannot have creativity in the absence of fearlessness, or you cannot have creativity in the presence of fear. So fear and creativity are absolutely antithetical. They cannot, they cannot exist simultaneously. It's impossible. If there is fear, creativity is compromised. If there is creativity, fear has no scope. So, and Tagore, this famous poem that we were made to read by our teachers, and the teachers hardly took any interest in this poem. In the middle school, if I remember correctly, where the mind is without fear and the head is held high. Iconic, absolutely brilliant wording, where the mind is without fear. So that's the starting point. The mind has to be without fear. And if the mind is without fear, and if the head is held high, then everything in the name of creative, artistic pursuit is possible. But if there is fearlessness, then of course everything gets compromised. So dialogue, in my opinion, is premised on fearlessness. Dialogue implies a certain principled loyalty, allegiance, commitment to fearlessness. So, if I were to then deduce a dialogic sensibility and commitment to dialogue are indispensable for any creative pursuit. If we are talking about creativity, if we are talking about creative collaborative pursuits, then we have no other option but to talk about the centrality of a dialogic sensibility. There is absolutely no possibility whatsoever for any creative pursuit in the absence of a dialogic sensibility. So that's the second thing that I wanted to put on record. And just to, because this is also, I'm sorry for this detour, but I'll take 2 minutes to refer to a very important, shall we say, incident or a narration. There's a book that came out recently on public universities in the modern world. And in that book, one of the most iconic philosophers of our times, Martha Nussbaum, has written an article, and it's titled The World Citizen. Now, Nussbaum, of course, Nussbaum has been writing about cosmopolitanism, world citizen, etc. But Nussbaum, in this particular piece, is trying to sort of look at universities as sites of cosmopolitan thinking and the possible production, or shall we say, the possible generation of world citizens. And in this particular piece, she talks about this famous Greek philosopher, Diogenes. Now, Diogenes, we are told, is the first philosopher, is the first human being actually to talk about the world citizen. So the idea of the world citizen was first referred to, was first spoken about by Diogenes, this incredible philosopher. Now, Diogenes, of course, millennia before Tagore, could figure out very early in his career, in his life, that for independent thinking, right, something that philosophers were cut out for, independent, fearless, radical thinking, one needs to do away with patronage. So, in classical Greece, as some of you would know, most of the philosophers and intellectuals were under the patronage of some aristocrat, some senator, some rich person of consequence. This was the usual drill. There was nothing unusual about it. This was as normal as anything else. But Diogenes, being a gifted philosopher, could figure out that if you are under the patronage of some aristocrat, some person, some politician of consequence, or some rich person, then you will not be able to really think freely. So he arrived at this very painstaking realization that if you really have to think fearlessly and freely and independently, you must do away with all kinds of patronages. You must renounce this network of patrons. So, as a result, Diogenes renounced the existing networks of patronage, and he voluntarily lived as a poor person. He got out of the polis and he started living as a poor person. So he had a tub to himself and he would just live in that tub. But he was, of course, free. And one fine day, Plato, of course, someone we talk about more often, Plato was walking down the road. And Plato looked at Diogenes. And Diogenes was washing lettuce, right? Lettuce leaves that we use in salad off and on. So Diogenes was just sitting in a corner next to his tub, and he was washing lettuce. And Plato tells Diogenes, in fact, almost as a well-wisher, Plato says that had you been attending or had you paid a visit to the court of Dionysus, you would not have been washing lettuce. Right? And he said this genuinely, as a well-wisher, that had you paid a visit or had you been in attendance in the court of Dionysus, you would not have been washing lettuce. And Diogenes turns and says that had you been washing lettuce, you would not have been in attendance at the court of Dionysus. It's a very clear case of priority. You either decide to wash the lettuce or you decide to be in attendance in the court of Dionysus. If you are in the court of Dionysus, there's a certain compromise that you've already made as an intellectual, as a philosopher. And if you're washing lettuce, well, one thing is for sure, that there's a certain fearlessness in your artistic, creative, philosophic pursuits. So this was just a detour, but I'm assuming it was worth it. After that, so fearlessness bit. The third thing that I want to kind of present before you in relation to my understanding of dialogue is that it is, and I'm assuming that this is not really something absolutely novel. Maybe some of us are already aware of it, but nonetheless, let me just put this on record. Dialogue is, for me, a powerful antidote to certainty. And certainty and the human world and certainty don't really go together. There is always, they are never found in an embrace. The human world has a deep allegiance to uncertainty. So dialogue and that's why dialogue is so quintessentially human. There is something markedly human about dialogue itself. So dialogue nurtures our deep human commitment to the unknown. And we know very well, if we go back to our history, there was, I think, the reason although, of course, mainstream evolutionary theory, etc., tells us that we have only become more and more civilized. But there is another vantage point to this, which tells us that we are only becoming more and more demystified and we are becoming more and more disenchanted because we are entering into a world that is more and more calculated. A world that is more and more known is a world that is more and more demystified. It's a dry world. It's a disenchanting world. It does not really offer a certain music that the human spirit yearns for. So dialogue nurtures our deep human commitment to the unknown, the uncertain, and our primordial instinct to let go something out of our hands. This was something that characterized us for many millennia. And then as civilization dawned upon us and as human beings became more and more civilized, they only got into more and more control and conquest. And therefore certainty took over and uncertainty took a backseat. So in the world in which we live, I think we live more with the logic of certainty and certitude. And we don't want mysteries. We don't want surprises. Of course, I'm not talking about those absolutely mediocre, below average birthday party surprises or this party surprise. That's not the surprise that Tagore is interested in. Tagore is interested in the, shall we say, the accidental. I think that's something that he has invoked in many of his songs. The accidental, right? Something that is not procedural, something that just happens and it catches us by surprise. It catches us off the guard, and it has a very deep educational potential for us. So this primordial instinct that we have, unfortunately, we don't have it. Most of us don't have it, to let go something, right? So we have very tight grips these days. We just hold on to things, and we want everything to be a part of the known. And there is this, in fact, the march of science and progress is essentially to do with chartering as many territories of the unknown as possible. So we are constantly trying to kind of turn as much of unknown into known as possible. Now, remember, in this context, again, Tagore writes beautifully. There's one in one of his poetic compositions. He writes, not here, elsewhere. That's the line. Not here, elsewhere. If you think about it and you take a moment, you realize that there is such an extraordinary depth and profundity to these few words. Not here, elsewhere. And this essentially tells us about what is deeply, we call, a dialogic sensibility, because a dialogic sensibility is always committed to this idea, this absolutely Tagorean, but more originally Upanishadic idea, not here, elsewhere. So this whole thing about the willingness to be surprised, and we need to think about this, that is education really geared towards turning us more receptive to surprises, right? This willingness to be surprised and be blessed with what Tagore beautifully frames as the sense of wonder, right? So if you have some allegiance to this idea of sense of wonder, if we think that there is some merit after all in this sense of wonder, then one way or another we will be driven towards dialogue, because dialogue is in some senses geared towards the sense of wonder, the willingness to be surprised. And lastly, in the context of how I look at dialogue, dialogue is also a stellar response to fragmentation. So what Tagore calls, he says, life cut into symmetrical conveniences. This is the line in the essay. So dialogue in some senses is a very powerful response to fragmentation. And the world in which we live is a world that is fragmented. It's a world that distances us from a deep realization of wholeness, harmony, order. This is something that Tagore also talks about, that we need to be pushed towards this idea of wholeness, that an education must facilitate this realization of wholeness. And remember, knowledge, according to Tagore, takes us towards fragmentation. Acceptance takes us towards wholeness. Now, Tagore's take on education, if you think about it, and if we look at, again, I don't think we have time. I mean, at least I don't have that much time left to speak about the essay from start to finish. But if I have to kind of just quickly look at one or two pointers, and broadly, what is it that Tagore is up to in this particular essay? In some senses, Tagore is making a case when he's talking about education, particularly children's education. Tagore is making a case for the mental, the intellectual mental, the physical, and the spiritual coming together. So education for him, and in some senses, this is very much a critique of the modern Cartesian understanding of education. That is, that insists on the mental. And Tagore is pointing out that no, education actually is a combination of the mental, the physical, and the spiritual. So there is a certain dialogue that's already happening between these three different realms or faculties. And it is only through this coming together of of the mental, the physical, and the spiritual that we arrive at fullness, wholeness, right? The sense of harmony that he refers to. And this fullness, wholeness, sense of harmony is sustained by acceptance, the logic of acceptance, and not the logic of knowledge. Dialogue essentially takes us above knowledge and it paves the way for acceptance. So if we invest earnestly in dialogue, then in some senses we are going to soar above the planes of knowledge and we will enter into the realm of acceptance where we begin to, shall we say, we begin to realize the sense of harmony in a very different way. So when we are talking about education as dialogue, we are also looking at wholeness and we are trying to do away with, or we are trying to check fragmentation in its tracks. And there's a certain parallel here because Marx, and some of you might have read Marx, when Marx writes about capitalism, and he's written brilliantly, of course, I don't think anyone has been able to really, as it were, nail capitalism down as Marx. Nonetheless, when he talks about capitalism, one of the concerns that he has in relation to labor is the idea of the fragmented man, the alienated man. And according to Marx, in capitalism, we all live fragmented lives. In other words, any individual in capitalism is not able to cater to various faculties of his or various faculties of theirs. So an individual should paint, an individual should read, an individual should play some music, an individual should just sit doing nothing, an individual should do some fishing, walk, dance, sing, and also work. So ideally speaking, and that's one heck of an ideal to think about, we should be working only for 2 to 3 hours, and that is good enough. And as for the remainder of the day and night, we attend to other faculties of ours. And it is only by doing that we arrive at the idea of what Marx famously called the whole man. The whole man who is going to rise in communism, right? In a classless society. So the whole man is not possible in the world in which we live. The whole man is only possible in a world where mode of production is completely different, where private property does not exist, and so on. The terms and conditions of work and labor, etc., are changed radically. So, in some senses, Marx was also talking about this importance of the whole man and the sheer problems with fragmentation or fragmented living, fragmented man, etc. So I come back to this question, and I think it is a very important question, particularly in the times we live in. I think the question has acquired peerless significance in our times. What does it mean to be educated? What does it mean to be educated? What does it mean to know, right? Is knowledge simply a matter of acquiring a particular document, attending a particular class, adhering to a certain timetable slot, or there is more to education. There is more to acquisition of knowledge. And Tagore is interested in, when he is interested in this question, what does it mean to be educated? And more importantly, he is interested in the formative phase, in the phase wherein the very foundations of education are laid down. He is interested in children's education because that's where a lot can happen, and that's where you can ruin generations after generations, something that we have done with a sense of pride. We have ruined generations after generations without an ounce of remorse. So, for instance, just to go back to Tagore's essay, if you think of walking barefoot, and he talks about it, says beautifully, almost as a poet, he writes that, he says, I carry a thick soul of ignorance beneath my feet. So basically, he's talking about footwear. That when we walk with our footwears on, we deprive our feet of their education. So when he talks about this whole idea of walking barefoot, when he's talking about a child climbing a tree, when he's talking about, he's not, but let's say if we think about a child chasing a butterfly, or someone marveling at the sky, the clouds, the moon, the stars, and so on, all of this, in my opinion, suggests education as dialogue. Because when we marvel at these things, and when we pursue these things, and when we think about these as realms of education, looking at the moon, looking at the stars, looking at the clouds, the sky, with a sense of wonder that Tagore repeatedly refers to, that willingness to be surprised endlessly, we are essentially entering into the realm of education that is completely beyond the grasp and grips of schools. Schools will never be able to. This is not to demean the importance of schools, but schools, remember, school us, right? Schooling has, there's a certain functionality to school and schooling. So all of this, whether it's a child chasing a butterfly, or it's a child marveling at the blooming of a flower, or the flight of a bird, and so on, or just, rain and clouds and trees and leaves and flowers and so on, all of this is basically education as dialogue. So there is education, although there is no teacher. Not teacher in a formal sense. Of course, the flower is the teacher, the bird is the teacher, the sky is the teacher. But there's something so remarkable about this particular education that is happening, because this is an education that is inward. This is an education that is oriented towards the self. This is an education that is leading to understanding, and it is not about explanation. Explanation is the education where a butterfly is drawn on a blackboard, or you use a chart with a butterfly, and you explain various parts of butterfly and the colors of butterfly. That's explanation. Or let's say a tree on a chart, and you explain various parts of tree, and you also explain why trees are important, and so on. Because an important thing is, and I'm heading towards the end of my talk, the important thing is that explanation always keeps things very cut to cut, very calculated, and very instrumental. So, for instance, and I've said this earlier as well, but let me just repeat myself. For instance, even when we talk about the importance of trees, we need to ask ourselves, why do we consider trees important, right? And that's where our education comes in. And we tell ourselves that trees are important because they provide oxygen. Trees are important because they are important because we exist due to them. You cut down trees, then in some senses you are essentially cutting down, or you are lowering the span of human life, and so on. Now remember, this is not really an unconditional love for trees. This is a very procedural, instrumental, cut-to-cut, calculated understanding of tree, which is coming from our schools and colleges and education, curriculum and whatnot. But when a child touches a tree, the Tagorean child, and a child tries to kind of embrace a tree, climb the tree, and generally lean on its branches and so on, the child is least interested in the facts. The child simply accepts the tree. So the knowledge of the tree is one thing, and the acceptance of tree is another. And the acceptance of tree is something that will tell us that every life form has an equal right for existence, whether they offer oxygen or not. So even if at some point later we get to know that we've been fooled all along and trees don't provide oxygen, and this was a farce all along, and they do nothing. Even in that kind of a world, we will not let a single tree be cut down. That's the logic of acceptance. Because knowledge would simply tell us that, if they're not doing us any good, why on earth should they be around? Why can't we have expressways and sprawling malls and city centers and whatnot? So this is something that we need to think about when we are thinking about education as dialogue, right? And lastly, because I think it's important to also realize that very often we kind of exaggerate. I wouldn't use the word exaggerate, but let's say very often we mistakenly draw connections between education and change. So a lot of times when you ask people, what is it that we could do about growing communalism? People say, educate the people. What is it that we could do about growing instances of patriarchy? People say, educate. What is it that we can we can do about growing caste violence? Educate the people. So it seems that for everything, for every evil that we are struggling with, education happens to be a quick antidote. But that's not really the case. We need to also ask ourselves what kind of an education, because this is utter nonsense. This whole idea of education and social change, a very direct, uncomplicated relationship, is absolute nonsense, because we know very well that there are educated bigots. And we also know very well that they are uneducated, and uneducated in a formal sense. There are uneducated beacons of hope and faith. So therefore, just to end, I think it is important to go back to the likes of Tagore, an extraordinary modern South Asian luminary, particularly with respect to his reflections on education, wherein we find that education is to be released from a certain kind of an instrumental caging, and is to be thought about as something that has an independent value, or has a value of its own, independent of any reference. And in doing so, we need to kind of move from the fragmented to the whole, from explanation to understanding, from the outward to the inward, from originality to truthfulness, and from knowledge to acceptance. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Irfanullah. It was an amazing lecture as usual. I can see a lot of our participants smiling. Whoever have comments or questions, please raise your hand and I'll take you one by one. Please, Ada, yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this very interesting yet intriguing lecture. I have two quick questions on you. First, it was regarding a conversation between Plato and Diogenes. You said that it's better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven, what John Milton says. So what about not choosing patronages but being enforced by certain kind of patronages we see, and being at the realm of fair, where our fearlessness is taken hostage of? First of all, what do we do in those cases? Second, lastly, you mentioned the Tagorean child who just accepts the tree. It's not drawing the butterfly or something else. But every life form has an equal right of existence, whether it gives something or not, whether it is for us of any use or not. I presume, being a Muslim, what do you suggest about animal slaughter or certain other things? What do we do about that? Thank you.
So thank you for these wonderful questions. In relation to the first question about the conversation that took place between Diogenes and Plato, I think, of course, the conversation took place in a completely different context. So I'm assuming Diogenes could do what he did because there was no forced patronage. He could essentially live a life of a pauper and do some brilliant stuff as a result of that. But in the world in which we find ourselves, there is, of course, a degree of coercion. No two opinions about it. But I also believe that there is an element of agency that still exists. we can always, at least as far as my reading goes, and I stand corrected, please correct me if I'm exaggerating the claims of agency. But my reading is that we always have some agency. So, for instance, if you think about the world that we associate ourselves with, the academic world, for instance, and we think about a certain state high handedness, a certain onslaught that people have been referring to vis a vis curriculum, vis a vis vocational, etc. I think we always had agency and we still have agency. It's just that most of us have simply decided to fall in line because we have, for some reason, we've become very clear and about this whole idea. What's the point? Like, what's the point of activism? What's the point of resistance? And that is the reason why universities have, in some senses, become, no offense, breeding grounds of mediocrity for the most part, and servitude and compliance, as opposed to sites of radical thinking and dissent, principled, celebrated, dissenting sort of voices. Because most of our academics have fallen in line. But then I categorically say most of our academics, we still have quite a few left in the academia who are beacons of hope, and we remain infinitely indebted. So yes, there is an element of fear. There is an overarching ambience of fear and some sort of, yeah, there is anxiety all around. But I think in this, there are people who have decided that they will call a spade, and they are willing to bear the cost. So I know a lot of academics who have called a spade, and as a result of that, they have not been promoted for 10 years, 15 years. But that's what it is. You end up washing lettuce, as Diogenes did. So it's end of the day, it's about our sense of priority. So whether we want to become a professor by falling in line, or we want to remain an assistant professor by not falling in line. So there are pros and cons. But between Plato and Diogenes, we decide, right? So there are few, not so many, but there are few who've still decided, thankfully, to carry on with washing lettuce. And that's brilliant. I think that's what keeps us going. So I suppose I get it that there is a certain, the landscape in which we find ourselves, intellectuals have become courtiers. They've become courtiers with patrons all around. And of course, the regime will be more than happy to offer patronage to intellectuals because the regime actually has scarcity of intellectuals. It is really deprived of serious intellectual stuff. So any intellectual worth their salt will be wary of that, I hope. But yes, the landscape is not very assuring, but we still have sparks here and there, and I think that is something that should keep us going. So that's your first question. In relation to the second question, I am assuming so every life form has an equal right. Now, when we get into religion, right now, religion has a certain religion works with a very different grammar of life and death, right? Now, this is not to kind of get into a certain claim vis-a-vis non-vegetarianism and vegetarianism, because then if we get into this debate, then we'll have to extend it. Then my hunch is that we can't even pluck wheat, because then we have no other option but to die. And therefore, because we also have a right to live, and this right is essentially premised on some degree of violation of the broader code, I suppose. But at the same time, I also, just to kind of, just to add to this, I also want to point out that there's a difference between need and a certain industry that gets erected out of this need, or false needs, as Marcuse calls it. So while on the one hand, I'm not taking a position, and I don't think anyone should take a position in terms of dietary preferences, but at the same time, a certain kind of an industrial takeover of a certain need, whether it is vegetarianism or non-vegetarianism or organic food, is something that we need to be wary of. So In the context of Islam, for instance, yes, of course, meat eating is something that is not prohibited. But if meat eating acquires a certain magnitude, as a result of which all kinds of absolutely unethical practices, crazy practices go on unchecked, so antibiotics, the poultry farming issues, etc., and that's because of this massive consumption. So when it all turns into a certain kind of a hyper consumeristic landscape, then I think there's a problem with that practice. Because people say that the Prophet loved meat, absolutely. But we should also ask how much did he eat and how often did he eat? So one is not in the absence of the other. So if people were to kind of be moderate in their aspirations and consumption patterns, then I don't think any of these questions would really, in my opinion, would really see the light of the day. I think the question as such is more to do with the scale and not as such with dietary practice per se. That's my opinion, but I stand corrected.
Thank you
Sorry.
so much. Poonam, you can go next.
Yes, thank you so much, sir, for such a wonderful lecture. My question is it's not question that some confusion regarding, as you emphasize in the beginning of your lecture, on the originality and truthfulness. How in academia there is originality, but there is no truthfulness. So can you clarify it further, and like with example, it would be great. And second question is, like you said that fearlessness is prerequisite to the creativity, but I don't know, I may be wrong, but sometimes I have felt that creativity helps to process the fear. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So, uh, so in relation to this originality and truthfulness distinction, that and Tagore beautifully writes in the essay. I think in the beginning he writes that I shall resist the temptation to be original and find. This is not verbatim, but I'm assuming that's what I'm just paraphrasing him. That I shall resist the temptation to be original and find contentment in merely being truthful. I think that's the line. Roughly, that's what the sentiment is. So he's making a distinction. Now, in the academia, what I was referring to, so being original, for instance, so when do we usually refer to the idea of originality? Usually, originality is referred to in our academic production. So when we write academic papers, right? So let's assume for a moment that I have written an extraordinary paper on injustice. Yeah. And as an academic, I have nailed it. I've figured it out. I've cracked the puzzle. Injustice, inequality, discrimination, you name it. Now, it's an original paper, and academia, I think, exaggerates the claims of originality, but let's just go ahead with this idea, the original idea and whatnot. Now, let's say that there is some state high-handedness in a university. So let's say students have been beaten up badly by police, and there is a signature campaign. Yeah. There's a signature campaign, and the signature campaign is simply to condemn the high-handedness, right? This brutality, as we say, the police brutality. Or take another example. Let's say a teacher got suspended, yeah, and there is a signature campaign in support of that teacher or those teachers who got suspended, not for corruption or sexual harassment, but something that is not even inconsequential. Right? Let's say a teacher just wrote an email making a case for something and got suspended. I'm not saying that a teacher getting suspended for sexual harassment, we need to have, a solidarity statement. No, that's nonsense completely. But I'm talking about, a teacher who got suspended for no reason, or some other signature campaign. Now, this particular academic, me, who has written extraordinary pieces on injustice, on exploitation, on the modern forms of nation state, etc., in all likelihood, I will not sign. Right. And we have seen this repeatedly, that people who are so prominent in terms of their academic production are hardly found in campaigns when things really matter. Now, what is happening here? Well, simply, originality. So I could be original, but originality has to do with my audience. So originality is something that I receive. It's a response that I receive from the outside, right? But truthfulness is something that only I know. So you could consider me original, but deep down I know that I am a complete sham, right? I am a hypocrite of the most fearless sort. And most of our academics know this, that they've been writing about some extraordinary stuff, but in their day-to-day lives, they remain horrendously compromised, right? And you name any university, whether you talk about JNU or Jamia or Ambedkar or South Asian University, that is usually the case. That we have all kinds of tall claims. And when we go into our classrooms, as I was pointing out, we steal the show. We are eloquent, we are flawless, and what an extraordinary performance we give. But then in our day-to-day lives, we remain horrendously shallow and compromised. This is the question of truthfulness. So end of the day, the question is, am I truthful or am I simply being original? So originality is something that is to do with the outward. Truthfulness is something that's to do with the inward, right? The self. And it is something that only I can figure out, whether I'm really truthful or not. The example also, truth in general, truth is a subjective position. Whether you're lying or you're not lying, that is something that can be figured out by cross-checking facts. But whether you're being truthful or not is something that end of the day only you can figure out, right? It is not something that others really have a say about. So that's the first thing. In relation to this fearlessness creativity thing, of course, there are other ways in which we can look at it, but I was merely borrowing from Tagore because, and I think that any genuine creative pursuit is premised on an idea of a fearless existence. So now one could also say that fear leads to creativity. That's another argument. And a lot of extraordinary poetry in Latin America, in Russia, in Soviet Russia, in India, actually came to the fore when we had the most suppressive political regimes. So Stalinism gave rise to some of the most extraordinary Russian literature, right? Holocaust gave rise to a very different literature, and so on. But that is, to me, again, not to demean it, that is not the rule. That's the exception. Which is to say that we cannot make an argument that so that we can have great literature, we need to have Stalins one after another. That's not an argument that can be made. It's not an argument that can be sustained. So the rule is that we should all be fearless. And Tagore is also talking about the children, that one of the first things about children is that they are actually fearless. And parents, and he uses this beautifully, that parents, because they live in the world of habits, parents instill fear in children all the time. Now, this is not to say that you let a child get drowned in a well, or you let a child, fall from the rooftop. No, of course not. But there are different ways in which you tweak things and you maneuver the child. You can always manipulate the child in less fearful ways. But as parents, and I do this all the time. I'm another hypocrite here. So when I have to kind of make sure that my child doesn't do what he or she is doing, I do this. I instill fear, and my parents did that to me. So, and this is not healthy at all, because this sense of fear has a direct bearing on this creative aspect of childhood. So childhood is about a certain fearlessness. A child just reaches out for everything and anything. Garam chai ho, pani ho, wo to sab kuch hota hai. Fearlessness. But of course, we don't let a child get burnt, but we need to kind of be more creative about it. And Tagore's argument is that because we are not fearless, we create a culture of fear all around, right? The psychology of fear, Carl Jung has written about this. So only those who are fearless themselves can create freedom all around. And there is a fundamental connection between fearlessness and freedom as well. And Tagore writes about this in another essay. So that's what I was thinking about. But yes, there could be an exception to this, that very often creative pursuits can help us process our fears. One can write very creatively about one's fears. But that is an exception. Generally speaking, we should have an existence where we are absolutely fearless. And that would lead to all kinds of wonders and magical moments in our lives. That's Tagorean premise. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Zikra, you can ask your question next.
My question is, in what ways does Tagore's educational philosophy challenges current educational system and policies? And what can we learn from his ideas to improve our education system today? Thank you.
So, I think one of the fundamental things about, so if you're specifically looking at children's education, school education, right, then Tagore is questioning the very premise, which is to do with the fact that education is something that is imparted in specific structures, let's say the classroom, right? Or education is merely and only to do with the mental and not the physical and the spiritual. So when he talks about this idea of a child climbing a tree, right? Now, how many of us in the times we live in really consider this as a matter of education, right? An educated child knows how to climb a tree. Now we are increasingly, he writes beautifully that we raise children in a world that is apparently, that has no trees. Because how is it possible that you are growing up in a world that is full of trees and yet you know nothing about, climbing a tree? And in the countryside, of course, there's a certain romance, and one needs to question Tagore for that romance of the country, romantic aspect of the countryside. In the countryside, it is part of your growing up. So if we are looking at the contemporary, particularly in the context of India, education is looked at in a very instrumental, cut-to-cut, end-driven stuff. So you do this, and it will lead to this. And I think after COVID, there is something absolutely pathological about some of the online courses for children. This morning only, for some strange reason, Facebook was constantly popping ads about public speaking courses for children. Now you can imagine the pathology of it. Why on earth should I want to teach a 7-year-old public speaking? What's the need? There's absolutely no need. But these are courses that are, and I'm sure there are, as we speak, already 2 or 3 admissions have taken place. So because these are parents who want their kids to become the likes of Kennedy and Luther by the time they turn 10. But that's not really what education is really for. And this is once again the outward. What is public speaking? Public speaking is once again performance. It's about the outward. But education, according to Tagore, is fundamentally and primarily about the inward. It should do something to the within. The rest of the world could just, and if something really transformatory, revolutionary happens within, then you cannot escape the changes out. There will be changes outside. It's impossible that you change from within and you don't change things from in the outside. But then, as I was pointing out earlier, that it is the reordering that Tagore is interested in. We start with the self. We start with the inward. And from there. So the contemporary education, particularly school education, is very much outward driven. And it is predominantly geared towards the mental. Of course, there is a lot of insistence on co-curricular activity and whatnot. Complete nonsense. Nobody really learned anything from, or most of us did not really learn anything from co-curricular activities. We know very well that the drawing lessons, the art lessons, were the ones that kept us, that essentially, what should we say? They played a very important role in our dislike towards art. The way in which art was taught, they turned us anti-art. It happened. It happened to me. The way in which literature was taught, poems and short stories, it turned us against poems and short stories. We were never to go back to literature because of the way in which, and universities are no exception either, the way in which English literature students with so much conviction say, I hate literature. Or what that's the tragedy. So I think this is something that Tagore is pointing out, that there is more insistence on outward. And it's a very end-to-end, instrumental, end-driven kind of a system. Now, what can it offer? Again, because Tagorean understanding of education is not about relevance. So it's not something that really caters to the market, again. It is something that's to do with the human aspect of our day-to-day life. So again, a question could very well be, let's say, if a child learns how to climb a tree, what does it do? And that's a very important question. It doesn't do anything, honestly. But then there is a certain significance about a child learning how to climb a tree, because the child develops a very intimate familiarity with the tree. And that's when the understanding of the tree of the child is very different as compared to the understanding of a person who is at a distance observing the tree, a botanist's understanding of the tree. So Tagore is, I don't think in terms of policy, it can really offer much, because Tagore is not working from the vantage point of policy and planning. He's looking at a very humane, deep, existential premise of education, which has got nothing to do with taking the boxes. It's something that is on its own independent, and it is indifferent to what the market says. So you learn how to climb a tree, you walk barefoot, you look at the moon, you simply wonder at the stars and clouds. And anyone can ask this question, what's the point? What's the point of looking at the moon? Of course, there's no point, but there is a point after all. So there is something about that experience of looking at the sky, the clouds, chasing a butterfly, and so on, and getting absolutely marveled by colors all around. But the market does not give a damn. The market simply needs dry subjects. I'll just take a minute. I remember the first class, not the first perhaps, but the first year I started teaching in Jamia, and this was the year 2009. And I was teaching BA students a subsidiary course on Indian society. And we were discussing urban and rural many years ago. And it was a full house, roughly about 70 students. And most of them were very spirited, straight out of school, excited about college life. So I asked them about their thoughts on life in a village. And they had all kinds of crazy, bad things to say about the village. The villages where you have caste, you have inequality, you have backwardness, these are illiterate people, all kinds of things. Some of them were from village as well, but I'm assuming they remain silent. And then I asked them about their thoughts on city, right? The urban pockets of India. And of course, they had great things to say about the city. So they were working with a certain binary, right? That the village is this and the city is this. And then I asked them this question, and I was surprised. Until date, I just can't believe that this happened. I asked them, how many of you have looked at the sky for no reason? Right? And you will not believe this. And they were honest. They were being truthful. So not a single student raised their hand. 70 plus students. Now, of course, it's not like they don't know the color of the sky. They have looked at the sky, maybe when they were flying kites or when they were looking at an airplane, but just looking at the sky for no reason, just marveling at its expanse and the mystery. And not a single student. And I said, most of you are from cities, so figure out the problems with city living. And they said, yeah. And some of them are still in touch with me, and they still go back to that question. And they figured out the tragedy of modern education. And not even once did they think about it. So I think, and now if I have to then, if there could be a counter question, let's say someone asks, what's the point of looking at the sky? What does it do? Actually, it does nothing. but I'm assuming that there is something about looking at the sky. And we can't get this through the conventional tropes of schooling and learning. I think we have to go beyond knowledge and get into acceptance and a sense of harmony and wholeness. So in relation to the second point, the second part of your question, I really don't know. And that's my take. Others can always share their thoughts. I don't think Tagore really offers much hope for planning or documents, because his is a very ideal, romantic take on education. And usually planning people don't work with such essays. They work with very cut-to-cut data-driven stuff that is commissioned by World Bank, Oxfam, DFID, etc. So Tagore doesn't really offer much. But if we think in general about how he conceptualizes education, I think there's something remarkable about his theorization and the formulation.
Thank you. This just brought me back to one of my childhood incidents, actually, where I was learning art. When you said that we disliked art, ironically, our art teacher was affiliated to the Rabindra Sadan or Rabindra Bhavan of our city. And I remember I painted in black and white, and I got a slap on my face that, you can't make landscapes in black and white. And years later, like probably 20 years later, when I went back to, when I first visited Europe and I saw my first snowfall, I could never find that art teacher. I had forgotten his name, but I thought of that art teacher, and I wanted to take like some of the pics that I took back to him and say that, look, you can have black and white in landscapes. And so, yeah, you're right. So we do end up hating subjects that we were not taught well. So
the only solace in this entire narrative is that you have forgotten his name. I think that's.
Yes, I was young. I was probably like.
No, it's good that you have forgotten the teacher's name. I think that's the only way in which you can find solace in this narration.
I remember his nickname. We used to call him Dadial Sadial Sir. So he was strict. Pardon my French. Okay, so we open to more questions. We still have a lot of time, and I think I've enjoyed all the question answers pretty much till now. So please feel free to ask. Asna, you're smiling.
Okay. Good evening, ma'am and sir. First of all, thank you for such an intriguing talk, because Education and Society was one of my papers in my previous sem. So I really liked it. I had also gone through Tagore's theory and all. And the way he wanted education to be an active engagement with nature and experiences. And as you said, a process of acceptance rather than gaining knowledge. Throughout your talk, I was morely attentive to that part of education being an outward-driven thing rather than an inward thing. So the whole process of education, as far as I am concerned, have become a process of showing people that I have acquired this or that, or, to show people that I have something in possession. Not to, completely understand or accept it as what it is. So my question basically is that, I would like to know, what is Tagore's view of schools or institutions where education is taught? And how would Tagore see it? I know, how did Tagore see it? And also, I would like to bring in the idea of homeschooling, which some parents are trying nowadays. And how would it connect with Tagore's idea or Tagorean idea of education? That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Asna. You said you did a course on education and society.
Yes, sir.
In JNU?
No, in Jamia. I'm doing my undergrad there, so I had a paper.
In sociology or in education? No.
Sociology. So I took the CBCS paper from in sociology and education and society. So we had Tagore's theories and all.
Okay. So this paper was offered, I'm sorry, I'm just being a bit curious. This paper was offered in the Department of Sociology?
Yes, sir. Yes, it did.
And who taught this?
Roma Bhattacharya. She is in contract. She's not a permanent professor over there.
She's from JNU. Okay.
Yes.
So just to go back to I think two questions, as in part one and part two. See, Tagore was never really in favor of schools as such, because if we go back to the English usage as well, and for instance, if I say you need to be schooled, right? Now, I don't have to really spell out what is it that I mean. It's a very distasteful expression. So and so needs to be schooled, and therefore we have an entire book. And I guess Roma did refer to this particular work, Deschooling Society by Ivan Illich, an extraordinary work. And Illich is, of course, a radical. Illich really takes it to the other end. And he is of the opinion that we completely need to do away with schools. And not just schools as institutions, but a certain way in which people get disciplined. There's a fantastic work by Samuel Bowles and Gintis in the context of schooling in America. And this was 1970s, I suppose, if I remember correctly. And Bowles and Gintis are their argument is that schools simply serve the purpose, simply serve the function. So there is a certain functionality to schools. They actually produce the labor that is required for capitalist pockets. And they go on talking about how schools swear by a certain grammar, as a result of which we get a subservient labor force, right? So for them, schooling is nothing else but something that facilitates capitalism. So we have Michael Apple's Ideology and Curriculum, etc. There are many works. So Tagore, of course, is writing way before any of these folks, and he is very clear that schooling is something that does not really help much, because he thinks about school and childhood as sort of very different camps. And the question is, can you really make sure that childhood is nurtured alongside schooling not happening? Right? It just cannot happen. The only possibility is play school, but I'm told in play school as well, now kids are taught. So as long as kids are not taught, things are fine. But the moment you start teaching them, well, there's something that you end up doing to their childhood. And the position, not just of Tagore, but of many other educationists, for instance, because you referred to homeschooling, there's a great Austrian philosopher, Rudolf Steiner, who has, so you have a chain of Waldorf schools, and a lot of homeschoolers essentially follow that curriculum. So Steiner was also talking about the importance of delayed learning. So if you think about our society, I've seen many parents who take pride in the fact that their kids not only know the name of several countries, and these kids are about 4 years old, so they know the name of 50 countries, their capital, the currency, and on the map they can point out this is where Denmark is and this is where Mexico is, and they think that these kids are great. But actually, these kids are a tragedy, right? Kids are not supposed to know, not at that age, of course, at that tender age. Kids are supposed to not know anything. And if they at all know, they should know on their own. So, for instance, chasing a butterfly, that's the kind of knowledge, that they must have. So schools usually don't let that slowness come in. So schools keep offering information. And as a result of that, kids get programmed, and there's a one-dimensional learning that takes place. So all the kids, so initially, if you actually go to preschool situation, kids grow up in different ways, but it is thanks to schooling that we all end up becoming equally boring individuals after 12 years, right? There's hardly any diversity left. And some of us end up acquiring some novelty, but there's not much hope there. So if we were to not get schooled, perhaps there would have been more diversity, there would have been more inquisitiveness. But in schools, what happens is that you have a straightforward catering. So it's almost like, and Steiner has given this example, that if you're walking with your child and the child sees a butterfly and the child asks, "What's this?" you straight away say, "It's a butterfly." And that's the end of childhood. At least a part of childhood is dead, because now you have straight away informed the child it's a butterfly. What about where if you were to also demonstrate a certain sense of surprise and wonder and pretend as if this is something that you're also seeing for the first time, and let the child pursue it and figure out the butterfly on their own? Now, that will never happen in a school. In a school, you have periods after periods, and you have charts after charts, and you have blackboards after blackboards, and 5 hours, 6 hours, all kinds of drilling takes place. And by the time the kid is back, it's not the same kid. It's a different kid. And we, of course, pay for that mediocrity and for that, for the lack of better word, corruption. So that's Tagore's position. Of course, I'm kind of cribbing a bit more, because I'm also one of those homeschooling parents. So our kids also don't go to schools because we can afford. Our parents never gave a damn. I don't think my parents ever read Tagore. Now, in relation to homeschooling, I think generally speaking, you can't really stay out of the structure. So you'll have to think about the examination, a certain standard of performance, etc. But I think homeschooling is essentially no schooling. So when kids do nothing, that's homeschooling, basically. So homeschooling is not about the fact that other kids go to school at 8 o'clock, whereas my kid is going to be studying at 8 o'clock inside the house. No, that's not the deal. My kid is not going to study, and will just learn things as a matter of accident. The accidental that Tagore so beautifully, the primacy of chance in the human world. And there are so many wonderful novels and films that are made on the idea of chance, that a lot of stuff, and if we go back to our own biographies, much of what changed our lives was actually a matter of chance, right? Life itself is chance in some senses. So this whole idea of homeschooling, and so no schooling, and also slowness. So homeschooling is about letting a child experience their childhood for a much longer period. So I don't think I really experienced a childhood, because I was sent to school when I was 3. There's something really brutal about it. And you start at 3, and then you don't end till your PhD defense, right? There's no break in between, like continuously 19 years of, even more actually. It's an endless journey. And but that is something that I don't think kids really deserve. I think they need to kind of bloom at their own pace and with their own rhythm. So I think that's the Tagorean departure, right? And homeschooling, in some senses, of course, there's much more to it, and my wife does much of it. In fact, all of it, because I'm busy elsewhere. But my position is that homeschooling is about that much needed slowness, and that's childhood and slowness go together. You can't really have a fast-paced childhood. That's really not good. Something that happened to us, right? We don't know when it came and when it just disappeared. It was hardly there for a while, and before we knew it, and Tagore also writes that we send them to schools and we turn them into adults overnight. And when he says adults, it means that these are people who have no sense of curiosity left. They are already dry. And there's something very tragic about a 6-year-old, 7-year-old not really interested, curious, and excited about things, right? But that's what schools do. And more importantly, we pay them for doing that. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a wonderful question, Asna. Next question, Janiali, would you like to ask something or have a comment?
Yeah, I have a question. It's not, but generally his school of thought. So Tagore emphasizes a lot on spirituality, a lot on nature, the earth as a whole, and it has a lot of tenets of like humanism and cosmopolitanism. And for some time, when the first wave of globalization hit us, it felt like it could be a reality when boundaries were disappearing, and we had this sort of ideas of global citizenship and shared resources and shared problems. But now I feel like this wave of globalization has kind of reversed. Like now we are mostly looking inwards. People are focusing more on boundaries. And in the era of violence and wars that we live in, there is a situation of hyper nationalism. So, how would you analyze the current scenario with a Tagorean perspective? Like, what would your take be from Tagore's point of view? Like, how would you say, and what could be possible? Could you say that the ideas were very utopic, or would you say that we could actually learn something from Tagore's ideas on such topics and maybe incorporate them?
Which ideas being utopian? The inward stuff.
Like cosmopolitan.
Okay, cosmopolitanism. Okay, so that's a good question. See, one of the things about Tagore is, and I think he is in some senses fearless in that regard. I think he's the only person. Is a certain coming together of nativism of a progressive kind and cosmopolitanism. Tagore is, I don't think there is anyone at that point who has traveled as much as Tagore. At that point of time, the man has actually traveled all the way to Latin America, Far East, you name it. I think all the continents, barring Africa, I'm assuming. He's been to everywhere. And this is the early 20th century. I think the only rival is our Prime Minister, who's traveled perhaps as much. Nonetheless, so despite traveling so much, Tagore remained markedly Indian in his thinking, right? And Ram Guha has used a fantastic phrase to kind of capture this confluence, and he calls Tagore the rooted cosmopolitan. And that's a brilliant phrasing, the rooted cosmopolitan, somebody who was exposed to so many cultures and civilizations. But at the same time, when it came to his way of thinking and imagination, he remained Indic, Indian in the most marked sense. And if you go back to, again, this is just a passing reference, if you go back to this famous debate that took place between Gandhi and Tagore, and this is an extensive debate in relation to non-cooperation, when Gandhi was making a case for non-cooperation, and Tagore was very clear that Gandhi completely lost it. And of course, I'm sure Tagore would have said other things about Gandhi, but he resisted the temptation. This had to do with that fact that there has to be a certain confluence. And Tagore always was a man of confluence, a man who believed in meeting points and interfaces and so on. Now, in relation to this whole globalization reference that you draw our attention to, the important thing is that if we are talking about a certain kind of nativism as a response to globalization. So there are two ways in which we can think about this anti-globalization or post-globalization position. One is a very chauvinistic nationalist position, which, in my opinion, is not to be, at least I wouldn't endorse it. I can't really speak for others, but I would be the last person to endorse a certain kind of a very exclusivist, chauvinistic kind of a nationalist position. That is anti-globalization. But if it is a position that is informed by a certain kind of, that is informed by a deep awareness of the problems that globalization has brought about in the remotest and most marginalized sections of Indian society, then I'll be the first one to endorse it. Something that somebody like P. Sainath has brought our attention to in the context of farmer suicides, for instance. So basically this whole idea of turning inward, and as opposed to getting carried away by these global financial markets and investments and stock markets and whatnot, we need to think about what's happening within the country. And it is here that I find a stunning resemblance between what somebody like P. Sainath and others talk about and Tagore's iconic essay, Nationalism in India. Some of you might have read this piece. This is a collection of essays that came out in 1917 at the peak of the First World War. And Tagore wrote, so the three long texts, nationalism in Japan, nationalism in the West, and nationalism in India. And in this essay, Nationalism in India, Tagore starts with this very profound line. He writes, our problem is social and not political. right? There are fundamental problem is social. So once again, political turns us outward, right? Politics as an exercise is to do with the outward, and that's where Gandhi wanted to redefine politics in India by bringing in the ethical, spiritual, moral aspect of politics. But Nehru did not let him do that. So Tagore is saying our problem is social. The moment we say problem is social, we are turning inward. And nationalism's problem, according to Tagore, is that it does not let us turn inward. Nationalism invariably works with this logic of the cultural and political other. And without the cultural and the political other, nationalism of the sort that Tagore was questioning cannot survive itself. It just cannot sustain itself. So you have to have an other. So in the case of India, you have to have an other. In the case of Germany, you have to have another. Now, if you were thinking about social problems, for instance, then you are interested in hunger, as in not interested, but you are concerned about hunger, poverty, malnutrition, casteism, communalism, bigotry, patriarchy, chauvinism, sexism, you name it, homophobia. Now, these are the things that are very important. And the moment you are geared towards these problems, then you just forget people next door. Forget in the sense that they don't really matter. You first have to really attend to what's going on within the family, within the house. So I suppose this whole idea, I think in some senses one can see a certain semblance of thought when it comes to Tagore's idea of civilizations and Tagore's idea of education. Because in both the cases, the greatness lies or the merit lies in looking inward and not looking outward. And I think there's something very deeply, once again, something that I was pointing out, I suppose, earlier, there's something very deeply Upanishadic about it. And Tagore, in some senses, is massively influenced by the Upanishadic philosophical ruminations. And Gitanjali, in some senses, his marvelous composition, is in some senses an abbreviated version of the Upanishads. So Tagore remained that person who was always talking about this whole idea that the source of light is within. And this whole quest all around the world is completely pointless, because end of the day you will find enlightenment within your own self. So this whole globalization thing, I get the point, but as I pointed out, that one has to also figure out what is leading to that sentiment, that anti-globalization sentiment. If this is a very shallow, tentative, superficial, hasty politics that is premised on a certain kind of shallow populism, then I suppose it's a problem. But if it is to do with a very informed critique of globalization, and that is backed by data, and that is backed by credible evidence, then I suppose, yes, I think in many ways. And Tagore, we know very well that Tagore was, in some senses, not in favor of industrialization of the sort that he was seeing in the West. And he's written a beautiful essay again. It's called The Modern Age. And as a result of that, Tagore, so the modern age is about what all industrial shift has done to the modern world. And which is why if you read most of the stories of Tagore, the city is always pitched as a site where things don't happen the right way. So Tagore works with this, of course, it's a very problematic binary, but he works with this binary of the village and the city. And the city, he's not very happy about the city. City and Satyajit Ray, through his films, I think he's very Tagorean. He carries on that legacy through the cinematic. If you look at, the city and the village, particularly in the trilogy, the Pather Panchali trilogy, so there's a way in which the city is always considered as a problematic, a gray space, a problematic space, and a village where all kinds of possibilities exist, but because it is neglected, people are simply not able to really realize their potential. So that's what I would say. This is again very tentative. I just hope that I was able to attend to your question. It's very tentative response.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, I think. Sukena or Kripa or Sonal or anybody would like to have a comment or a question, you feel free to ask. Dr. Farooqi, I have a question in case, you know. I would really like to know, how does Tagore's ideology or his thinking, how is it reflected, in his ashram of Santiniketan? And since you also know about Gandhi, is there, how I don't know, how does it contrast with Gandhi's ashram or Aurobindo's ashram? That is something I'm just curious about.
So I think, as is the case with most of the ashrams, there's been a lot of degeneration. Um, so when Tagore was around, and we have accounts, and Gandhi has written about his stay at Shantiniketan. There are others who've written about their years at Shantiniketan. Of course, things were remarkable, and the experiment was on to something extraordinary. But after Tagore's departure, for reasons more than several, the institution could not really hold on to its original premise. And now, again, I have not been to Shantiniketan, but now, just as is the case with Gandhi Ashram, I think it's more to do with a certain shallow allegiance to a tradition, and not really a full-fledged commitment. So even today, if in Shantiniketan, you find a few people walking barefoot. I don't really know. Again, I should not have the last word, but I've been informed by a few students who were educated at Shantiniketan that now it's just appearance and not essence. So whether we are talking about the music classes or we're talking about the art classes, that the idea of this wholeness that Tagore was insisting on is something that is not to be found. And of course, Shantiniketan administration, the VC's high-handedness, etc. A lot of things that very much remains in the news. But I won't go into how is it working as a university. But I think whatever little it has to do with Tagore is more to do with a certain sham of an association with a tradition. I don't think it is really to do with what Shantiniketan stood for or what Shantiniketan meant for Tagore as an experiment. And exactly the same thing could be said about Gandhi ashrams all over the country, and definitely Aurobindo ashram, etc. Of course, you will see a lot of portraits, you will see a lot of quotations, you'll see a lot of stuff that goes back to the golden age when Aurobindo was around and Gandhi was around and Tagore. But I don't really know. Again, I have only been to one ashram in Haridwar, and I was there for about a few days, but I just did not. The caretaker of the ashram was hardly anything to do with. He just didn't really click. I did not find anything extraordinary. Not even ordinary. Forget extraordinary. That's just too much. But because of the kind of audience they cater to. So a lot of tourists and foreigners, now these people apparently are starving for some spiritual dose. So they were very contented in the blissful atmosphere of that ashram. But anyone who has read a bit on what Aurobindo has to say about the unity of the human psyche, etc., and on meditation and the rest, I don't think they'll find anything even remotely associated with the giant, the Aurobindo legend. And in relation to Gandhi Ashram as well. You'll see a charkha here, you'll see something else there. But the whole idea of manual labor and dignity of labor and concentration and small is beautiful, etc. I don't think any of that is happening in any of the Gandhi Ashrams. I know about 2 Gandhi Ashrams, so I should not perhaps pass a judgment on this. But I think in all likelihood, for various reasons, they have really dissociated themselves from the actual essence. And these are more tourist sites, and these are more, shall we say, they just become centers of attraction, and people come and they get photographs clicked, and then they leave. There's not really anything deep about their existence in true sense of phrase.
Thank you. Does anyone have any comment or question? Any more? Okay, So I think we can end the session. Thank you so much, Dr. Farooqi. You have amazing clarity of thought, and you can, I think, connect different ideas and explain it in communicate in absolute simplest terms so that people can, even the layman can understand. So I think that is something which one of the reasons I absolutely look forward to all your sessions. Thank you again for being with us today. And I'm sure our participants enjoyed the session quite a bit.
Thank you for inviting, and thank you, each one of you here, for your comments and questions. It was absolutely delightful.